"Congratulations, sweetheart," my future mother-in-law said, tapping her wine glass at my own engagement dinner. "The restaurant will finally have proper management once my daughter takes over the books." 40 guests raised their glasses. Nobody noticed my phone was already recording, and nobody knew the call I'd taken 20 minutes earlier had just confirmed exactly what she'd been doing with those books for the past 8 months. Hey guys, welcome back. If you clicked on this one hoping for something messy, buckle in. Because this is one of those stories where the villain genuinely thought nobody was paying attention. My name is Simone Ashworth, and I own a small farm-to-table restaurant in Portland, Oregon called Birch and Bramble, a place I built from a single food truck into a 40-seat restaurant with a 2-month waiting list over the course of 6 years. I want to tell you exactly what happened at my own engagement dinner, in front of 40 guests, because I think about that night constantly, and I don't think I'll ever get tired of telling it. I met my fiancé, Julian Marchetti, through a mutual supplier about 3 years ago. He worked in hospitality consulting, easy to talk to, genuinely funny, the kind of person who made you forget you were exhausted after a 14-hour shift. His mother, Diane, ran a catering company out of the same city, moderately successful, mostly living off contracts she'd inherited from her late husband's connections, rather than anything she'd built from scratch herself. And from the very first family dinner I sat through, I noticed something I chose to explain away for far too long. Diane didn't talk to me like she was meeting her son's partner. She talked to me like she was evaluating an asset that hadn't been properly appraised yet. For the first year, the comments were small enough to brush off, or at least I told myself they were small enough. Diane would ask at every single gathering whether I'd considered professional help managing the restaurant's finances, always phrased as concern, never once actually sounding like concern. Julian would mention, almost gently, how much less stressed I'd be if I let someone handle the business side while I focused on just cooking, a sentence that used to make my stomach turn even though I couldn't fully explain why at the time. I didn't push back hard enough because I was busy. Birch and Bramble had just been written up in a regional food magazine, and I was working nonstop trying to keep up with the reservations that came pouring in afterward. Julian proposed that spring, in front of both our families, at a lake house his mother had rented specifically for the occasion. And I said yes without hesitating, because I genuinely believed at the time that he was proud of what I'd built, rather than circling it like something his family thought they were owed. The real shift started about 7 months before that engagement dinner. Diane began helping out at the restaurant during slow lunch shifts, which sounded generous, until I noticed she was specifically asking my back office manager, a young woman named Priya, detailed questions about our supplier contracts and monthly invoicing, rather than anything related to actual catering advice. Julian started asking more directly now whether I'd thought about who would keep things running once we got married, and I inevitably wanted to step back a little. A future I had never once mentioned wanting. When I brought it up with him, gently, he told me I was reading too much into a mother who just wanted to be involved in her son's life. I wanted to believe that. Some part of me needed to believe that, because the alternative meant admitting I was about to marry into a family that saw my restaurant as a future inheritance rather than my actual career. 3 months before the dinner, Priya came to me privately, visibly nervous, and told me something that made every uneasy feeling I'd been ignoring suddenly click into place. She said Diane had asked her, on 2 separate occasions, to route certain produce and dry goods invoices through a new supplier account instead of our usual vendors. An account Diane said she'd set up to save us money. Priya hadn't done it because it wasn't her call to make, but she'd noticed the invoices from that supposed new supplier were oddly vague, listing round numbers instead of itemized deliveries. The kind of paperwork that looks fine at a glance and falls apart the moment someone actually checks it. I sat with that information for exactly 1 night before I did something about it, because some part of me still wanted an innocent explanation to exist. It didn't. I quietly brought in an independent bookkeeper, a woman named Rosalind Chen who had audited 2 other restaurants in the neighborhood, and asked her to review every invoice tied to that account without telling anyone else in my family what I was doing. I need to be honest with you about something here, because I think it's the most important part of this whole story. I didn't confront Diane the moment I suspected something. I went quiet, in exactly the deliberate way you go quiet when you know panic will only tip your hand before you actually have proof. Rosalind spent 6 weeks going through invoices, delivery logs, and bank transfers, and what she found was worse than I expected. That new supplier account Diane had been pushing wasn't a supplier at all. It was a shell account tied to Diane's own catering business. And over 8 months, close to $11,000 in restaurant funds meant for produce and dry goods had been quietly rerouted through it under vague invoice descriptions. Funds that had then been used to cover Diane's own catering company's overdue vendor payments. Rosalind finished her report 4 days before my engagement dinner. I sat on that report, said nothing to Julian, and went to the dinner Diane had planned, at a restaurant she'd chosen, because I wanted to see exactly how far she was willing to take this in front of witnesses before I said a single word. The dinner started normally, awkward but manageable, the way most of these family gatherings had been for the past year. 40 guests, most of them Julian's extended family, and a few of my own close friends, gathered at a private dining room Diane had booked without asking me. Halfway through the appetizers, Diane stood up, tapped her wine glass, and announced, loudly enough for the entire room to hear, that she wanted to share some exciting news about the future of Birch and Bramble. She said that once Julian and I were married, it made the most sense for the restaurant's books and vendor relationships to transition under her catering company's management, so Simone can finally focus on the creative side without all that stress. 40 guests raised their glasses to toast a business decision I had never once agreed to, in a restaurant I had built from a single food truck, using books she had already been quietly draining for 8 months. I want you to understand something about that exact moment, because it's the part I think about the most. I wasn't panicking. I felt almost calm, in that strange, clear way you feel when a suspicion you've carried quietly for weeks finally gets confirmed out loud by the person you suspected in front of everyone who matters. 20 minutes before that toast, I had stepped outside to take a call from Rosalind, who confirmed the final piece of her audit had just come back from the bank. A direct transfer trail linking that shell account straight to Diane's business checking account, time-stamped and dated. I walked back into that dinner, sat down, and let Diane finish her toast completely before I said a single word. Then I stood up myself, thanked her for the kind gesture, and said that before anyone celebrated a management transition, I thought the table deserved to know exactly how the restaurant's finances had actually been handled over the past 8 months. I pulled out my phone, and I read the exact figures Rosalind had sent me 20 minutes earlier, out loud, to a completely silent room. Diane's face went white in a way I will never forget. Julian looked at his mother, then at me, then back at his mother, clearly doing the math in real time on exactly how long this had been happening under his own roof. I explained calmly, without raising my voice once, that an independent audit had traced $11,000 in restaurant funds to a shell account controlled by Diane's catering business, and that I'd already forwarded the full report to my restaurant's attorney earlier that afternoon, before I ever walked into that dinner. I told the room, as evenly as I could manage, that I had absolutely no intention of transitioning my restaurant's books to anyone who had already been quietly stealing from them. Nobody raised a glass this time. A few guests actually got up and left the table entirely, uncomfortable in a way that told me they'd noticed things too, and simply hadn't said anything either. Julian didn't defend his mother that night, which honestly surprised me more than anything else that happened. He sat there in silence for what felt like a full minute, then quietly asked me if we could talk outside. I told him we absolutely could, but not that night, because I needed him to sit with what he'd just watched his own mother do before either of us said anything we couldn't take back. Diane tried, weakly, to claim it was a misunderstanding, an accounting error, the kind of excuse that falls apart the second someone points out that misunderstandings don't typically involve deliberately vague invoice descriptions across 8 consecutive months. Nobody at that table bought it, including, eventually, her own son. The aftermath moved faster than I expected, honestly. I filed a formal restitution claim through my attorney the following week, and Diane, facing the very real possibility of a criminal referral for financial exploitation given the paper trail Rosalind had built, agreed to repay the full amount rather than risk it going further. Julian and I didn't call off the engagement immediately, but we did pause it, because I needed to understand whether he'd known anything at all, and it took several long, difficult conversations before I believed he genuinely hadn't. He eventually cut Diane out of any involvement with the restaurant entirely, permanently, and paid back the remaining balance himself once her repayment plan stalled twice. We got married 8 months later than originally planned in a much smaller ceremony, with Priya standing beside me instead of Diane anywhere near the guest list. Birch and Bramble is still mine, fully, on paper and in practice. And I still make every single decision about my own books myself, with Rosalind auditing quarterly now, permanently, because I never want to feel that specific kind of blindsided again. I think about that dinner sometimes, not with anger exactly, but with a strange kind of clarity, because the version of my life where I quietly accepted that toast exists somewhere out there, and I am endlessly grateful I never have to live inside it. If you'd been sitting at that table watching someone toast to taking over your business with money they'd already been stealing, would you have said something in the moment? Or waited until after the dinner the way most people probably would have? Tell me honestly in the comments, because I genuinely want to know how many of you would have stayed quiet. And if this story kept you glued to the screen, go ahead and subscribe, because there's another one just like it coming soon, about the people who assume you're not paying attention until the exact moment you prove them completely wrong.